Let's start with what you call this movement, a revolution. Why a revolution?
Well, as you know, there have been countless demonstrations and uprisings taking place in Iran. Even in the last 6-7 months, we've seen farmers and factory workers and retirees, a lot of people coming out onto the streets, clamoring for economic assistance, et cetera, et cetera. So there have been lots of demonstrations, lots of popular uprisings. But I think that what is required in order to elevate an uprising to a revolution requires a coalition that is national. So take what happened in 2009. That never had the opportunity to really expand beyond the young, middle-class, urbanized youth in Iran. And so therefore, it never really went anywhere. It just kind of remained a demonstration that ultimately fizzled out in, as obviously in response to the violent response from the regime. This time, however, what we are seeing is not just young people, but older people, not just women, but also men, not just progressives and liberals, but even conservatives and some regime supporters. We're seeing the pious population out on the street. Just a few days ago, we saw massive uprisings in the city of Qom, of all places. We're seeing women covered head to toe in chadors standing next to women in jeans and t-shirts who are unveiled, both of them calling for the downfall of the regime. And now we're seeing the business interests start to take part in it with the guilds and the strikes that are being called. And then I would say, most importantly, this isn't an uprising that's just happening in the large population centers. The majority of the provinces in Iran have seen major protests. And to me, all of that combined fits the definition not of an uprising, but of a revolution. The revolution is against the clerical regime and clerical rule. But it's important to understand that the theological foundation of the Islamic Republic, the Vilayat al-Faqih, which Khomeini invented out of his mind, that has absolutely no tradition in Shia political or religious thought for the last 1400 years, is still a very unpopular idea amongst younger seminary students and mid-level clerics. I think that there's this idea that all of the Shia clergy support the idea of clerical rule, and that's not the case.
But a lot of them are the beneficiaries of the system.
Precisely, yes. The upper echelon and the clerical elite, the people in the government, yes, they are absolutely entrenched in this system and they're going to live and die with it. But that is not the case when it comes to seminary students, mid-level clerics, your local preachers and local imams. And what I'm waiting to see is whether they will start taking the arguments that they've been having amongst themselves about the legitimacy of clerical rule, if they're going to start taking that out onto the streets. When you look at the 3 previous revolutions in Iran in 1906, in 1953, and in 1979, it really was the clergy who had the ability to bring the pious masses out onto the streets. They have been an integral part of every sort of major revolution that's happened in Iran, for better or worse. And I do think that there is the possibility that some of those younger seminarians who, as I say, never really supported theologically this idea to begin with, might start lending their voices to the people. What we saw in Qom, which is Khamenei's backyard, was extraordinary. To me, if that continues in other parts, in Mashhad, in other sort of more traditional places, then that might really signal the end of this regime.
I don't want to change the subject a lot, but because you mentioned 3 revolutions, including 1953, I want to ask you why you consider that particular one as a revolution as well.
Well, it was mass popular uprising that resulted in the downfall and exile of the leader of Iran. To me, that is the definition of a revolution.
But the government didn't really collapse per se, did it?
No, but the revolution wasn't against the government, it was against the Shah. And it forced the Shah into exile. And as we all know, the Shah was brought back onto the throne by the CIA. So to me, it was short-lived, there's no question about it. But again, that very much fits my definition of what a revolution is and what a revolution does.
You talked about the unity that we are seeing right now within the Iranian, not only in Iran, but also within the diaspora. I know there are a lot of differences, obviously, on how to deal with the Iranian regime. Why do you think this time around, people from the far left to the far right, they're kind of united on what they want?
I think that it's two things. Number one, the unity that we're seeing in Iran is very important for the reasons that I was saying. Coalition building, disparate groups, all with different grievances, but willing to unite together under a single common cause. And in this case, that cause is the removal of the regime from power. Not reform, not changes, but just the collapse of the regime. When you have retirees and 12-year-olds calling for that same thing, that's extraordinary. Here, however, in the diaspora, as you well know, as all your audience knows, we are a very fractured community. We spend far more time fighting with each other than we do fighting against the regime that is forcing suffering upon our families back home. But I think because the images that are coming out of Iran, because we are watching teenage girls sacrificing themselves for the most basic rights, it has almost shamed us, I think, in the diaspora. At least I feel like it has shamed us into tabling our stupid, petty arguments with each other about who's at fault for this, or what should come here, and how should it be, and is this person calling for reform, or is that person calling for revolution? How can that possibly matter? How can those arguments and debates possibly matter in the face of the extraordinary bravery of children that we are seeing in Iran? So I'm watching something that I haven't seen in 40 years of living in the United States, which is the Iranian community, for the most part, tabling our arguments and focusing on a single goal, the removal of this regime.
I'm sure right after this interview is broadcast, I'm going to get a lot of comments about your affiliation with NIAC. And there is no post that goes with NIAC and people, they don't talk about how this organization and people affiliated with that helped to legitimize the Iranian regime in the past decade or two, if you like. What's your take on that?
First of all, I'm not affiliated with NIAC.
You're listed on their website as a staff member.
Oh, no. No, that's... No,
in the staff section, your name is on NIAC's website.
Yes, I gladly and happily and proudly advise NIAC on their policies, because their fundamental goal is no war in Iran, no war in Iran. And any Iranian in America or in the diaspora that doesn't support that goal, I want nothing to do with. Because I care about one thing.
But it's not just being anti-war, is it? They were quite comfortable with a lot of Iranian authorities, including Javad Zarif, who was comfortably talking to Trita Parsi.
Again,
you took a picture with Khatami. You were quite comfortable with reformists in Iran.
Yes, of course. I met Khatami in Turkey and took a picture of him. Of course I did.
Would you do the same with Raisi if you see him?
Hell no. Raisi is a war criminal. But here's what I want to say. I'm not here to defend or support NIAC because I don't care. I don't care about NIAC. I don't care about the MEK. I don't care about the Saltanat Talabs. I don't care about Reza Pahlavi. I care about one thing, and that is that my family in Iran is safe from harm, that they are free from oppression, and I will support anyone who is working towards that goal. And this ridiculous argument that we're having, which is so much based on all this sort of Saudi propaganda about what Iranians should do. I think if anyone should mind their own business about what should happen in Iran, it's the Saudis. That's my particular opinion on it. But again, it's these petty discussions, these petty arguments about who did what and who does what and who do you advise. I will support anyone, any organization that is focused on making sure that my cousins, my uncles, my nieces, and my nephews are free. I don't care who they are.
With that in mind, I'm guessing then you would advocate or support sanctions that are being in place on Iranian officials right now.
Yeah, I've always supported targeted sanctions. What I do not support is the 4 decades of blanket sanctions that the United States has placed upon Iran. Those blanket sanctions have not done anything to hurt the Iranian regime. They've hurt the Iranian people. If you can't get medicine, if you don't have access
but
to
you know
the free
medicine
market,
are exempted from the U.S. sanctions.
Say it again.
But you know that medicines are exempted from the U.S. sanctions.
That's actually not true. The reason
it
why
is true though.
Well, look at the devastation that happened as a result of COVID in Iran.
But that's the Iranian supreme leader calling the authorities in Iran not to import Western vaccines, if you remember.
The person who is chiefly responsible for the suffering of Iranians is the supreme leader. That is the man who bears absolute responsibility for the destruction of Iranian society and the slaughter of Iranian people. But to say that U.S. policy has actually damaged the supreme leader or has done anything in the last 4 years to damage the Islamic Republic is demonstrably false.
But money helps, doesn't it? If Iranian authorities had more financial resources, they would do more harm to their people and the region.
There is a difference between targeted sanctions that keeps the Islamic Republic and the regime from accessing financial resources abroad and blanket sanctions that end up hurting the farmers and the factory workers and the retirees and the men and women and children who have to work 3-4 jobs in order to basically, to be able to afford the most basic goods and services.
But in an economy
you
that
do
is,
recognize the difference
I
between
appreciate where you're
blanket
coming from, but in an economy,
sanctions, right?
I appreciate where you're coming from, but in an economy that is highly controlled by the state, like the Iranian one, it's not a free economy. The IRGC has full control over the Iranian economy.
Okay, let's talk about that. Why is it so fully controlled by the state? It's fully controlled by the state because for 4 decades of blanket sanctions, containment, and isolation has resulted in a situation in which the state now is the economy. We saw this in 2009. People ask all the time, why aren't the poorer people coming out and supporting these students? Well, because the poorer people rely on the government for bread, for their most basic needs. Why is that? Because that idea that we could just blanket sanction this country into changing.
But even if there was no sanctions, Iran wouldn't be a free economy. It wouldn't be Singapore. They wouldn't let Facebook or Coca-Cola to come and operate in Iran, obviously.
No, but there would be an opportunity to build a far more stable middle class. It has always been the case in Iran that yes, the pious masses, they have the numbers, but it's always been the middle class in Iran that has had the ability to create profound change. This has been true for more than a century. But you tell me about the middle class in Iran right now. There is no middle class in Iran right now. There is the rich who are associated with the clergy and who are getting fat off the suffering of the people and figuring out ways to manipulate the economy to their advantage. There's the Revolutionary Guard and the military who basically own entire industries in Iran. And then there is everybody else. 40% of the population living under the poverty line, 50% inflation rate. That is the suffering of the people, not the regime. We have the ability to make very clearly targeted sanctions on the Ayatollahs and the Revolutionary Guard members who are responsible for the death and suffering of Iranians. But we also have the ability to use economic and interdependent trade relationships to give those young people in Iran the opportunity to actually have access to the rest of the world. Right now, we had to go through an enormous amount of effort in order to get the Biden administration to roll back some of its internet sanctions. Why do we have to wait for a revolution to roll back internet sanctions? If anything, that's precisely the kind of thing that young people in Iran need in order to make their voices heard. Sanctions are a blunt instrument, right? It's very, very difficult. And even now, we're talking about targeted sanctions against specific officials. It's hard to know how useful that is 45 years into a blanket
But short
program.
of military action, this is the only tool you have, right?
Oh, there you have it. Beautifully said. When we have spent 4 decades blanket sanctioning Iran, we have essentially removed our ability to influence that country in any way. What are we going to do? You said it perfectly. What else do we have left? We got nothing else to do but do some targeted sanctions that may probably do a little bit of damage to, some mullah's, pocketbook or whatever. That's all we have, because we have no ability to really punish Iran anymore.
Do you really think if we had full economic relationship with Iran, they would listen to the West?
Nobody is talking about full economic relationship. Please don't put words in my mouth. What I am talking about is interdependent trade relationships, like Iran has with Europe. Europe has far more ability than the United States does to influence Iranian actions. And don't kid yourself. The Iranian government can be punished. The Iranian government can be influenced. They can be shamed. They're not intractable in that way. There are things that, not the United States, but other governments can do.
Isn't it the same mentality that thought Iranian government can be reformed?
No, we're not talking about reform here. We're talking about punishment for bad behavior. You see, when you have no relationship,
give me one example that
connection.
Iran changed its behavior because of the European pressure.
Oh, I mean, I think what happened in 2009 is a very good example of this. Yes, we remember the horrible crackdown of the Iranian government on the protesters on the street, the way that they were able to just turn the lights off and just slaughter people at whim. But we also remember that the European government was able to put very specific economic prices on Iran for those actions that then resulted in a slight change in the government towards reform, the ability to actually be willing to talk to the rest of the world, the JCPOA, about removing Iranian nuclear weapons capabilities. Those were positive steps, but then of course it fell apart. We are not talking about a government that can't be pressured. This is not North Korea. Okay?
It's pretty close to it, though.
But it's not. It's close in the sense that it is a repressive society, but it's not a completely closed off society. There are governments around the world that maintain the ability to pressure and punish Iran. We're not one of those governments. And so here we are, stuck in this idiotic dichotomy, which is, well, it's either military engagement or what? Or what? Targeted sanctions? This is a false choice because it doesn't give us anything. Military engagement is off the table, and targeted sanctions barely does anything. What we really need to do is begin to work with our allies who do have some influence in Iran, because they have maintained interdependent trade relationships. Again, this goes back to where we started this conversation. We can talk about foreign policy.
But that comes in the scope of hoping that the regime within itself will reform or change in a way, right? Right now, people in the streets are asking for the total collapse of this.
No. We're talking, hold on. Don't confuse things. We're talking about the past. We're talking about what has 4 decades of blanket sanctions as foreign policy from America to Iran. What has that done? Has it made the regime weaker? Or has it entrenched
a lot of people would argue, yes, it did.
In what sense? We already discussed the fact that the regime is in charge of every aspect of the economy because it has no choice but to do so, because it doesn't have any interdependent relations. If you're the regime, let me put it this way. Iran asked to become part of the World Trade Organization. And whether you agree with that idea or not, just think about this for a minute. The World Trade Organization requires a set of principles that the government has to maintain in order to stay in the World Trade Organization, or if they don't, they get kicked out. That's called interdependence. Do something wrong and you can be punished for it. But if we can't punish you because we've already blanket sanctioned you for 4 decades, well then how do we?
But this blanket sanction wasn't in place from day one. It was transitional, right? During Reagan administration, they had some new sanctions.
That is day one.
Yeah.
This is 1980.
I know, but they added more and more to the point that IRGC is now listed as a terrorist organization in the United States.
That's our only answer. We are a one-trick pony in America when it comes to Iran. So one-trick pony. We have one answer. We have 2 answers. Blanket sanctions, military
What's the third
engagement.
one?
We don't have a third one anymore. That's why I'm saying we have to rely on Europe. We have to rely on those countries, including Russia, including China, that actually do have economic relationships and so can be pressured to change Iranian behavior. Again, whatever you feel about the nuclear negotiations, and I couldn't care less what anybody feels about the nuclear negotiations, but one thing that proved is that if China and Russia and Europe want Iran to do something, it will do it. And that is how foreign policy works. You have to be able to punish someone for bad behavior, but you can't punish them if there's nothing left to punish them with.
Just because we talked about reform, I know it's not the current issue right now, but when reformists were in power, were you supportive of them? Did you truly believe that the Iranian regime could be reformed back then?
I hoped. I really, really hoped.
Were you wrong?
Yeah, I think those of us who, in the 90s and in the early 2000s really thought that there's a possibility, there's a new wave, there's a young generation, there's a new generation of leaders in Iran that maybe this thing could be changed, that this thing could be reformed in some way. And I think that for a little while there was some hope. There was a glimmer of hope that could have happened. But you look at the last decade or and a half or so of what's happened in Iran, and I think at this point, even those of us who were the most hopeful, 10, 15 years ago, have been disabused of the opportunity, of the chance that reform is even an option any longer. This is a regime that right now is taking teenagers and putting them in what they're openly referring to as psychological centers for re-education. There's no reforming that. There's no reforming that. Once you're at the place where
although it's not a new thing, even in the Iranian 60s or 80s, they did the same with a lot of mujahideen and left-leaning.
Yeah, no, it's a standard Savak move. It's a standard Savak move is re-education. And listen, anyone who's watched Iran for the past 50, 60 years knows how much these ayatollahs learned from the Shah and from Savak. They're using a lot of the same moves from the playbook. But the larger issue is, at this point, I think those of us who hoped that there could be an opportunity for change in Iran, that there could be an opportunity for reform, that there is a real a chance that something could change. Over the last decade or so, I think we have been proven wrong. And I think at this point, the only option before us right now is that the end of clerical rule in Iran. Can it happen? I don't know, but I'm hopeful.
Reza Aslan, thank you very much. Thanks indeed. I appreciate it.
Here we go again. The same architects of the catastrophic war in Iraq are now pushing for another unnecessary conflict, this time with Iran. 16 years ago, George W. Bush declared mission accomplished on the deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln. Now, that same carrier has been dispatched to the Persian Gulf, where Trump's national security advisor, John Bolton, who never met a war he didn't like, is threatening unrelenting force against Iran. I'm Iranian. I left much of my family back in Iran when I fled the country. I don't want them or anyone else there to suffer the fate of Iraq. But I'm also American,
And I don't want any of my fellow American citizens to die fighting yet another unjustified war to satisfy a president's ego or to fulfill some foreign policy fantasy that's been proven time and again to be disastrous for America and the world. It's our responsibility as Iranian Americans to unite our two great nations in peace and to resist those who, for their own benefit, seek to divide us through war. Together, our voices will overpower the rising sound of war drums beating in Washington, D.C. Together, we create hope. Together, we will find peace.